The Union soldier who found Bill Anderson's saddle after the ambush at Albany counted for exactly 11 minutes before he had to stop. 53. 53 scalps braided into the leather. 53 different textures of human hair woven into the reins. Some brown, some black, some gray. One was blonde, almost the color of a child's. The soldier, a sergeant named Thomas Goodman, vomited twice. Then he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He started counting again. Because he needed to be sure. He needed the number to be wrong. It was not wrong. 53 human beings, documented, verified, each one taken by the same man, each one in less than 18 months, each one, and this is the part that history cannot explain, each one remembered by name. Bill Anderson kept count, not in some ledger, not scratched into wood. He kept count in his mind. He knew who they were. He knew where they died. He knew what they said before he took the knife to their scalp. But here is what nobody understands about bloody Bill Anderson, what the history books get wrong, what the movies never show. He was 24 years old when he scalped his first man. 24. The same age as a graduate student, the same age as a young father starting a family, the same age as someone who still believes the world makes sense. And by 25, by the time a Union ambush put 2 bullets in his skull on a road outside Albany, Missouri, he had done it 53 times, 1 year, 53 scalps. That is roughly 1 every 6 days, for an entire year. This is not the story of a monster. Monsters are born. This is the story of something worse. This is the story of how a monster is made. And it starts with something you need to understand about Bill Anderson before the war, something that makes everything that follows infinitely more horrifying. Bill Anderson hated violence. I need you to sit with that for a moment. The man who would become the most feared guerrilla in Missouri, the man whose name made Union commanders check their weapons twice, the man who would braid human hair into his horse's reins, hated violence. His neighbors in Agnes City, Kansas, remembered him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who helped with barn raisings and returned borrowed tools cleaned. He had a sister named Josephine. She was 14 years old. He called her Josie. He taught her to ride horses. He promised her he would build a house with a porch swing where she could read books in the summer. Bill Anderson wanted to be a farmer. That was it. That was the whole dream. Good soil, strong horses, a family. The war changed his plans, but not in the way you might think. When the fighting started between Kansas Jayhawkers and Missouri bushwhackers in 1861, Bill Anderson tried to stay neutral. Records show he refused to join either side for almost 2 years. He was not a Confederate. He was not a Union man. He was a farmer who wanted to be left alone. But the border war did not leave anyone alone. The Jayhawkers, Union guerrillas from Kansas, had a specific strategy. They would identify families with Southern sympathies. Then they would visit those families. And visit is a gentle word for what they did. Bill's mother was 61 years old when the Jayhawkers came to their farm. They wanted information about Confederate movements. She had none to give. They did not believe her. What happened next? I'm going to tell you, but understand, this is documented history. This is what turned a peaceful farmer into something else entirely. They beat her, a 61-year-old woman. They beat her with rifle butts until she could not stand. Then they set fire to the barn. Then they left. Bill was not there. He was in town buying supplies. By the time he returned, the barn was ash, and his mother was trying to crawl toward the well. She survived, but something in Bill Anderson did not. Still, he did not fight. Not yet. Because he had made a promise to Josephine. He had promised her that violence was not the answer. He had promised her that they would survive this war without becoming what they hated. Josephine believed him. She was 14 years old. She believed her brother could protect her from anything. And then came August 1863. The Union Army had a problem. The guerrilla fighters operating out of Missouri were devastating their supply lines. Ambushes, raids, attacks that came from nowhere and vanished before troops could respond. The commanders needed to stop it. Their solution was General Order Number 10, then General Order Number 11. These orders authorized the arrest and imprisonment of any woman or child related to a known guerrilla. Josephine Anderson was 14 years old. Her brother Bill had still not joined the fighting, but the Andersons had Southern sympathies. That was enough. Union soldiers arrested Josephine. They arrested Bill's other sisters too. They took them to Kansas City and locked them in a building on Grand Avenue. The building was 3 stories tall. It had been used as a warehouse. The women were kept on the upper floors. The guards were kept below. What happened next was either an accident or deliberate murder. Historians still debate it. The evidence suggests the truth is somewhere in between. On August 13, 1863, the building collapsed. The structural supports had been weakened, whether by Union soldiers removing bricks for other construction or by deliberate sabotage to kill the prisoners. No one knows for certain. What is certain is that the building came down. Josephine Anderson, 14 years old, was on the 3rd floor when the walls gave way. She did not die immediately. Witnesses outside the building heard screaming from the rubble. They heard girls calling for help. They heard, and this is the detail that would haunt Bill Anderson for the rest of his short life, they heard Josephine calling for her brother. "Bill, Bill, help me, Bill." The rescue effort took 6 hours. By the time they reached Josephine, she had been trapped under debris for most of that time. Her legs were crushed, her spine was broken. She lived for 2 more days. Bill Anderson arrived on the 2nd day. What he saw, what he heard, what was said between brother and sister in those final hours, no record exists. What we know is that when Josephine died, Bill Anderson was holding her hand. What we also know is that when Bill Anderson walked out of that room, he was a different man, not changed, different. As if the person who had walked in, the farmer, the pacifist, the brother who promised his sister they would survive without violence, had died in that room too. Someone asked him what he was going to do. A neighbor, a friend, someone who remembered the quiet young man who helped with barn raisings. Bill Anderson's answer was 3 words, and everyone who heard them understood that Missouri was about to drown in blood. "I will count." That was what he said. Not "I will fight," not "I will kill," not "I will have revenge." I will count. Within 2 weeks, Bill Anderson had joined Quantrill's raiders. Within a month, he had participated in the Lawrence Massacre, the raid that killed nearly 200 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas. Within 3 months, he had his own command, his own men, his own reputation, but it was not the killing that made him legendary. Other guerrillas killed. Other bushwhackers were brutal. What made Bill Anderson different, what made him Bloody Bill, was the counting. He kept count. Every Union soldier he killed, every jayhawker, every man who wore blue or fought for the side that had killed his sister, he kept count. And not just of the dead, of the scalps. The practice of scalping was not unknown in the border war. Both sides did it, though neither side admitted it in official reports. It was brutal, it was primitive. It was a way of marking kills that went back to frontier conflicts of the previous century. But Bill Anderson turned it into something else, something systematic, something that terrified Union commanders far more than any battlefield victory could. He braided them into his saddle, he braided them into his reins, and he knew every single one by name. Now I need to tell you about the first one, because the first one explains everything that came after. The first one tells you exactly what Bill Anderson became, and exactly what he remained even at the end. It was September 1863, 1 month after Josephine died. Bill had been riding with Quantrill for about 3 weeks. He had participated in the Lawrence Massacre. He had killed men, but he had not taken a scalp. Not yet. The guerrillas had captured a small Union patrol, 5 men who had wandered too far from their unit. Quantrill wanted information about troop movements. The usual interrogation began. 4 of the soldiers gave what information they had. They were released, or at least that is what the guerrillas told them before shooting them in the back. Standard practice for both sides in the border war. Brutal, yes, but impersonal. The 5th soldier was different. He was young, maybe 20 years old. He had a sergeant's stripes that looked new, and when Quantrill asked him about troop movements, he refused to answer. Instead, he said something else, something that would seal his fate in a way he could never have imagined. Those women in Kansas City. They were traitors. They got what traitors deserve. He was talking about the building collapse, about Josephine, about the women who had died under the rubble while Union guards watched. The young sergeant did not know that Bill Anderson was standing behind him. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Bill moved before anyone could stop him. The knife was in his hand before the sergeant finished speaking, and by the time Quantrill's men pulled Bill away, it was done. The first scalp. Bill Anderson stood there, breathing hard, holding what remained of the sergeant's hair in his fist. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wet with tears. He looked down at what he had done, and he said something that every witness remembered. That is one. Quantrill tried to talk to him afterward, tried to explain that this kind of violence would make them all look like savages, that the Union would use it for propaganda, that it served no military purpose. Bill Anderson listened. Then he said 5 words that ended the conversation. Her name was Josephine Anderson. From that day forward, no one tried to stop him. The second scalp came 3 days later. Another Union soldier. This one had not said anything about Kansas City. He was simply wearing blue. That is 2. The third came a week after that, then the 4th, then the 5th. By the end of October 1863, Bill Anderson had taken 12 scalps. By Christmas, he had 21. The number kept growing, and Bill Anderson kept count. But here is what nobody expected. Here is what made the Union commanders realize they were dealing with something they did not understand. Bill Anderson was not indiscriminate. He did not scalp everyone he killed. He did not scalp civilians. He did not scalp Confederate deserters. He did not scalp men who surrendered without being asked about Kansas City. He had criteria. Every man he scalped had either been involved in the Kansas City imprisonment or had expressed support for it, or had served under commanders who had ordered it. Bill Anderson asked questions before he killed. He gathered information. He compiled a mental list of who deserved what he had planned for them. This was not mindless violence. This was something far more disturbing. This was organized, systematic vengeance. This was a man keeping a ledger of blood, and every entry in that ledger was for Josephine. By the spring of 1864, Bill Anderson's reputation had spread across Missouri like a fever. Union commanders issued specific warnings to their patrols. Do not engage Anderson's guerrillas without overwhelming force. Do not surrender to Anderson's men, and above all, do not speak about Kansas City if captured. The warnings did not help. Bill Anderson had become something the Union Army had no category for. He was not a soldier following orders. He was not a bandit seeking profit. He was not even a terrorist in the modern sense. His violence was not random, was not designed to create general fear. He was a bookkeeper, an accountant of death. Every scalp was a transaction. Every braid in his saddle was a receipt. And the account was not yet balanced. Let me tell you about scalp number 27, because 27 is when something changed. When even Quantrill, a man who had burned Lawrence to the ground, started to worry about what Bill Anderson was becoming. It was March of 1864. Anderson's guerrillas had ambushed a Union supply train near Richmond, Missouri. Standard raid. Kill the guards, take the supplies, burn what you cannot carry. Among the guards was a lieutenant, young, maybe 22. He had been wounded in the first exchange of fire, a bullet through his thigh that left him unable to run. Bill Anderson found him trying to crawl toward the tree line. The lieutenant expected to die. Every Union soldier captured by bushwhackers expected to die. That was the border war. No prisoners, no exchanges, no mercy from either side. But Bill Anderson did something unexpected. He gave the lieutenant water from his own canteen. He even wrapped the leg wound with a clean bandage. The lieutenant, a man named Charles Morrison, according to later records, was confused. He had heard the stories about Bloody Bill. This was not what the stories described. Then Bill Anderson started asking questions. "Where were you stationed in '63? The lieutenant answered, "A post near Westport." "Were you in Kansas City in August?" The lieutenant hesitated. Then he made the worst decision of his short life. He told the truth. Yes, he had been in Kansas City. He had been part of the unit that guarded the women prisoners. He had not been on duty the day the building collapsed. But he had been there. He had seen the women brought in. He had heard the screaming after the walls came down. He could have lied. Bill Anderson would never have known. The war was full of anonymous soldiers, men who fought and died without ever being identified. A simple no would have saved Charles Morrison's life. But he told the truth. Bill Anderson's face changed. The witnesses, his own men, described it as watching a door close. One moment there was something human behind his eyes. The next moment, nothing. 27, Bill said. Then he took out his knife. What happened next took about 90 seconds. Bill Anderson was methodical, efficient. He had done this 26 times before. He knew exactly where to cut. He knew how to keep the scalp intact. He knew how to minimize his own exposure to blood. When it was done, Bill Anderson stood up. He looked at his men. Some of them had been riding with him for months. They had seen him kill dozens of men. They had participated in the Lawrence massacre. They looked away. That is when Quantrill pulled Bill aside. "Bill, this is not war anymore. This is something else." Bill Anderson did not argue. He did not justify. He simply looked at Quantrill and said something that explained everything and nothing at the same time. She was 14. 3 words. The same 3 words he always said. The same 3 words that silenced every criticism, every objection, every attempt to reason with him. She was 14. Quantrill had no response. What do you say to a man whose sister was crushed under Union rubble at 14 years old? What argument can you make to someone whose entire existence has become a monument to that death? Quantrill walked away, and from that day forward, Bill Anderson operated with increasing independence. His own command, his own rules, his own count. By April, he had 31 scalps. By June, 38. By August, the anniversary of Josephine's death, he had 45. And then came Centralia. I have told you about Centralia before. The train, the 23 unarmed Union soldiers, the 10 seconds to pray, the 147 Union troops who charged 30 guerrillas and were slaughtered in 8 minutes. But I have not told you about what Bill Anderson did after Centralia. What he did in the days following, while the Union Army was still reeling from the worst guerrilla defeat of the entire war. He went hunting. Specifically, he hunted anyone connected to the Kansas City imprisonment, anyone who had guarded the women, anyone who had given the orders, anyone who had expressed approval of what happened. In the 2 weeks after Centralia, Bill Anderson added 8 more scalps to his collection, 8 more braids for his saddle, 8 more names he would remember until the day he died, which was not far away. Let me tell you about scalp number 53, the last one. It was October 1864. Bill Anderson was 25 years old. He had been leading his own guerrilla band for over a year. He had participated in dozens of engagements. He had killed more Union soldiers than any other Confederate guerrilla in Missouri. and his saddle held 52 scalps. The 53rd man was not a soldier. He was not even wearing a uniform when Bill's guerrillas found him. He was a civilian, a shopkeeper from Kansas City. His name was Daniel Weston, and he had made one terrible mistake in his life. In August of 1863, after the building collapse, Weston had been quoted in a Kansas City newspaper. The reporter had asked him about the deaths of the women prisoners. Weston had said, and this was printed, recorded, preserved for history, "Those rebels got what was coming to them." He was talking about Josephine, about the other girls, about the women who died under the rubble. Those rebels got what was coming to them. For 14 months, Bill Anderson had remembered that quote. For 14 months, he had been looking for Daniel Weston. And in October 1864, 3 weeks before his own death, Bill Anderson found him. Weston was traveling by wagon from Kansas City to Lexington, a commercial trip. He was carrying fabric and household goods to sell in the smaller towns. He had a driver with him, a young man barely out of his teens. Bill Anderson's guerrillas stopped the wagon on a road near Wellington. The driver was released. Bill had no quarrel with him, but Daniel Weston was asked to step down from the wagon. What happened next was described by the driver in a deposition given to Union authorities 3 days later. The young man was traumatized. His account was fragmented, but certain details came through clearly. Bill Anderson asked Weston if he remembered what he had said about the Kansas City building collapse. Weston did not remember. It had been over a year. He had probably said many things about the war. Everyone said things about the war. Bill Anderson reminded him. Those rebels got what was coming to them. Weston's face went white. He started to apologize. He started to explain that he had not known what he was saying, that he had not understood, that he was sorry. Bill Anderson listened. Then he asked one question. How old was Josephine Anderson? Weston did not know. Of course he did not know. She was just a name in a newspaper story, a casualty statistic, a rebel who got what was coming to her. 14, Bill said. She was 14 years old. She called for me while she was dying, and you said she got what was coming to her. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. The driver turned away. He heard Weston screaming. He heard Bill Anderson counting 53. That was the last scalp Bill Anderson ever took. 3 weeks later, a Union ambush outside Albany, Missouri, put 2 bullets in his head and 2 in his chest. His men fled. His body was left on the road. The Union troops who found him did not believe it at first. This was bloody Bill Anderson. This was the most feared guerrilla in Missouri. He looked so young. He looked so ordinary. Then they found his saddle, 53 scalps, braided into the leather, woven into the reins. Some still had dried blood on them. Some had been there so long they had faded to gray. The sergeant who counted them, Thomas Goodman, the same man I mentioned at the beginning, testified later about what he found in Bill Anderson's saddlebag. A dress, a child's dress, torn and stained with old blood. It was Josephine's, the dress she had been wearing when the building collapsed. Bill Anderson had kept it for 18 months. He had carried it into every battle. He had looked at it before every scalp. She was 14. The Union displayed Bill Anderson's body for 3 days. They propped him up on a board. They took photographs. They let civilians come and look at the monster of Missouri. Some people spit on the corpse. Some people stabbed it with knives. Some people, and this is documented, though horrible, cut pieces of his clothing as souvenirs. But some people, a few people, just stood there silently, looking at the young man on the board, wondering what could have happened to him to create this. Because Bill Anderson was not born a monster, he was made into one, by a war that had no rules, by a Union policy that imprisoned 14-year-old girls, by a building that collapsed on his sister while she called his name. 53 scalps, 53 payments in a debt that could never be settled, 53 entries in a ledger that Bill Anderson kept perfectly, precisely, until the day he died. And here is the thing that history cannot explain, the thing that makes Bill Anderson something other than a simple villain. He remembered them all, every scalp, every name, every face. He did not kill indiscriminately. He did not slaughter for pleasure. He killed specifically, carefully, men who were connected, however tangentially, to the death of his sister. This was not madness. Madness would have been easier to understand. This was something worse. This was sanity in service of vengeance. This was a logical mind applied to an impossible equation. Josephine was dead. Nothing could bring her back. Nothing could balance that account. But Bill Anderson kept counting anyway, because counting was all he had left. There is one more thing I need to tell you about Bill Anderson's counting. One more detail that separates him from every other violent man in that violent war. He talked to them, before each scalp, before the knife. Bill Anderson talked to his victims. He asked them questions. He told them things. He explained what was about to happen and why. A Union prisoner who escaped from Anderson's camp in July 1864, a man named James Foster, gave testimony about what he witnessed during his 3 days of captivity. Foster had been spared because he was from Ohio and had never been stationed anywhere near Missouri, but he saw what happened to others. Bill Anderson sat with each man for at least 5 minutes before killing him. He would ask about their service, where they had been stationed, what units they had served with, whether they had ever been to Kansas City. If the answers satisfied him, if the man had no connection to the imprisonment of the women, he was usually shot quickly, standard execution, no scalping, no braids for the saddle. But if the answers revealed any connection at all, Bill Anderson changed. Foster described it in his testimony. It was like watching two different men. One was calm, almost professional. The other had dead eyes and steady hands, and a voice that never rose above a whisper. Foster specifically remembered one conversation, a Union corporal from Kansas. The man had admitted to being stationed in Kansas City in the summer of '63. He had not been a guard at the women's prison. He had been a supply officer, but he had been there. Bill Anderson leaned close to the corporal and asked one question. "Did you hear them screaming when the building fell?" The corporal said yes. He had heard them. Everyone in Kansas City had heard them. Bill Anderson nodded. Then he said something that Foster would remember for the rest of his life. "I hear them too, every night. I hear my sister calling my name. She was 14 years old. She called for me for 6 hours while she was dying, and I was not there." Then Bill Anderson took out his knife. 34, he said when it was done. 34. Foster escaped 2 days later. He ran for 20 miles through Missouri woods before finding a Union patrol. He never forgot what he had witnessed, and in his testimony he said something that captures the tragedy of Bill Anderson better than any history book. He was not a monster. He was a broken man doing monstrous things, and every time he killed, you could see it breaking him a little more. He was not enjoying it. He was suffering it. But he could not stop. This is the part of Bill Anderson's story that the legends always miss. The legends want him to be a villain, pure, simple, comprehensible. The legends want him to be evil incarnate, a demon who killed for pleasure. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that Bill Anderson was at war with himself as much as he was at war with the Union. Every scalp was a failure. Every number was proof that nothing he did could bring Josephine back. And yet he kept counting. Let me tell you about the knife. Bill Anderson used the same knife for all 53 scalps. It was not a military-issue blade. It was not a Confederate weapon. It was a kitchen knife, a simple wooden-handled blade that had once belonged to his mother. She had given it to him before the war, before the Jayhawkers burned their barn, before they beat her with rifle butts, before everything fell apart. "Bill," she had said, "this was your grandmother's. Take care of it. He had taken care of it. He had sharpened it every night. He had cleaned it after every use. He had kept it in a leather sheath that he had made himself, a sheath that hung from his belt right next to the holster for his Colt Navy revolver. The Union soldiers who stripped his body after his death found the knife. They also found the sheath, and inside the sheath, wrapped around the blade, they found a piece of paper. The paper was so worn that it was nearly illegible, but someone made out the words. It was a note, written in a child's handwriting. "Bill, come home soon. I miss you. Love, Josie." Josephine had written it to her brother months before she died. He had kept it next to the knife for over a year. Every time he drew the blade, he saw her handwriting. Every time he cleaned the blood from the steel, he remembered her words. "Come home soon. I miss you. Love, Josie." Some people, when they heard this story, felt sympathy for Bill Anderson. They saw the brother who had lost his sister, the man who carried her memory into every battle. Other people felt nothing but disgust. They saw the 53 scalps, the braided hair, the methodical violence of a man who had learned to kill as efficiently as a butcher. Both responses are correct, and that is what makes Bill Anderson one of the most troubling figures of the Civil War. He defies easy categorization. He was a victim and a villain, a brother and a butcher, a man who loved deeply and killed without hesitation. The Border War made men like this. The brutality of Missouri in the 1860s created monsters on both sides. Jayhawkers burned farms. Bushwhackers massacred prisoners. Civilians were killed for having the wrong sympathies. Children died in collapsing buildings while soldiers watched. Bill Anderson was not unique in his violence. He was unique in his counting. Now let me tell you about the men who rode with him, because Bill Anderson did not do any of this alone. He had followers, men who believed in him, men who watched him take those scalps and braided them into his saddle and said nothing. Some of those men would become legends themselves. Jesse James was 16 years old when he joined Anderson's guerrillas. His older brother Frank was already riding with the band. Jesse was young, eager, and he watched Bill Anderson very carefully. Years later, after Jesse James had become the most famous outlaw in America, he rarely talked about his time with Bloody Bill. But when he did, when reporters pressed him about those guerrilla days, Jesse would say something that revealed how deeply Bill Anderson had affected him. "Bill taught me that mercy was a weakness, that hesitation was death, that if you were going to do a thing, you did it all the way, no halfway, no regrets, all the way or not at all." This was not an endorsement of Bill's methods. It was a statement of what Jesse had learned. The border war had no room for moderation. You were brutal or you were dead. You counted your enemies or they counted you. Jesse James never scalped anyone. That practice was Bill's alone, but Jesse learned to kill quickly and without mercy. He learned to trust no one outside his own band. He learned that the law was meaningless in a world where soldiers imprisoned children and buildings collapsed on 14-year-old girls. Bill Anderson made Jesse James. The banks that Jesse would rob, the trains that Jesse would stop, the legend that Jesse would become, all of it was rooted in those months riding with Bloody Bill through Missouri. But here is something most people do not know. Jesse James was not Bill Anderson's most devoted follower. That honor belonged to a man whose name has been almost forgotten by history. Archie Clement. They called him Little Archie because he was barely 5 feet tall. He was 17 years old when he joined Anderson's guerrillas, and he was, by every account, completely devoted to Bill Anderson. Little Archie was there for most of the 53 scalps. He watched, he learned, and after Bill Anderson died, Little Archie continued the practice. Not counting like Bill did, not remembering names, but scalping Union soldiers with the same cold efficiency that Bill had demonstrated. When Union soldiers finally killed Little Archie Clement in December 1866, more than 2 years after Bill Anderson's death, they found 4 scalps on his body. He had never stopped. He had never moved past what Bill had taught him. This is the legacy of Bloody Bill Anderson. Not just the 53 scalps, not just the terror he inspired, but the men he trained, the violence he normalized, the example he set for a generation of young guerrillas who would become the outlaws of the American West. The James Gang, the Younger Brothers, the countless other bandits who terrorized Missouri and Kansas in the years after the war. They all traced their origins back to the guerrilla bands of the Civil War, and many of them had ridden with Bill Anderson. They had watched him count. Let me take you back to one more moment, one more scene that explains who Bill Anderson really was. Not the legend, not the monster, the man. It was September 1864. 2 days before Centralia, Bill Anderson's guerrillas had captured a small group of Union soldiers, 4 men who had been separated from their unit during a skirmish. 3 of the soldiers were young, scared. They said they were recent recruits. They had never been to Kansas City. They had never even been to Missouri before a month ago. Bill released them. He gave them water and food and pointed them toward the nearest Union position. "Go," he said. "Tell them what you saw here. Tell them Bloody Bill let you live." The 4th soldier was different. He was older, a sergeant. He had been serving in Missouri since 1862, and he made the mistake of trying to negotiate. "Anderson," he said, "I know you lost people in Kansas City. I know what happened to your sister. But this war is almost over. The South is going to lose. You know that. Everyone knows that. Why not stop now? Why not let the killing end?" Bill Anderson listened to this speech. He let the sergeant finish. Then he asked his standard question. "Were you in Kansas City in August '63? The sergeant hesitated. Then he admitted that yes, he had been there. He had been part of the unit that escorted the women prisoners to the building on Grand Avenue. He had not been on duty when the building collapsed. But he had been there. Bill Anderson nodded. Then he said something that revealed the core of his thinking, the philosophy, if you can call it that, behind every scalp. "You ask why I do not stop. I will tell you why. Because if I stop, then they win. If I stop, then my sister died for nothing. If I stop, then every man who watched that building collapse gets to go home and forget it ever happened. I will not let them forget. As long as I am breathing, I will make them remember." The sergeant tried to respond. He never got the chance. 47, Bill said afterward. 47. He died 6 weeks later with 53. Do you understand now? Do you understand what Bill Anderson was really counting? He was not counting kills. He was not counting victories. He was not even counting revenge. He was counting memory. Each scalp was a guarantee that someone would remember what happened in Kansas City. Each braid in his saddle was proof that the Union could not just kill children and walk away. Each number was Bill Anderson's way of saying, "I have not forgotten, and I will not let you forget." This is what made him terrifying to Union commanders, not the violence itself. Violence was common in the border war. What terrified them was the specificity, the purpose, the sense that Bill Anderson was keeping a record that would never be erased. And in a way, he succeeded. 160 years later, we are still talking about Bill Anderson. We are still counting his scalps. We are still trying to understand what happened to the quiet farmer from Kansas who became the most feared guerrilla in Missouri. Josephine Anderson is not forgotten. She is remembered because her brother refused to let her be forgotten. Every scalp, every braid, every number, they all pointed back to her, to the 14-year-old girl who died calling for her brother. Bill Anderson got what he wanted. The memory survives. But at what cost? 53 lives ended, 53 families destroyed, 53 men who had their own stories, their own dreams, their own people who loved them. Bill Anderson took all of that. He took it in Josephine's name. He took it because he could not take back what the Union had taken from him. He took it because counting was the only thing he had left. And when they killed him on that road outside Albany, when the bullets finally ended his count, Bill Anderson was 25 years old. The same age as a young father, the same age as someone starting a career, the same age as someone who still believes they have time to become something different. Bill Anderson ran out of time. The count stopped at 53, and Missouri was left to clean up the blood. But the story does not end with Bill Anderson's death. The story never really ends, because the people who survived him, the witnesses, the victims, the men who rode beside him, they carried what they had seen for the rest of their lives. Thomas Goodman, the Union sergeant who counted the scalps, never recovered from what he found on that saddle. He gave his testimony in December 1864. He gave it again in 1865 for a military tribunal investigating guerrilla atrocities. He gave it a third time in 1870 for a journalist writing about the border war. Each time he told the story, his hands shook. Goodman lived until 1891. That is 27 years after he found those 53 scalps, 27 years of remembering, 27 years of seeing those braids of human hair every time he closed his eyes. In his final interview, given just months before his death, Goodman said something that summarizes the tragedy of Bill Anderson better than any historian ever could. "I hated that man. I hated him with everything I had. He was a monster. He killed men I knew. He killed men who had done nothing wrong except wear the blue uniform." Goodman paused here. The journalist noted that his eyes had become distant, as if he was looking at something far away. "But then I found that dress, that little girl's dress, and I understood something I did not want to understand. Bill Anderson did not want to be a monster. He became one because we made him one. The Union made him. Kansas City made him. That building that fell on his sister, that made him." Goodman's final words were haunting. "We created Bloody Bill, and then we had to destroy him. But by then it was too late. He had already created more like himself. Jesse James, Frank James, little Archie Clement, all those boys who watched him count. They learned, and they kept teaching long after Bill was dead." The journalist asked Goodman one more question. If he could go back in time, would he have done anything differently? Goodman was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that revealed how deeply he had thought about this question. "I would have gone to Kansas City in August of '63. I would have found that building before it collapsed, and I would have let those women go. All of them. Every sister and mother and daughter we had locked up. I would have opened the doors and let them walk out into the sunlight." He paused again. "Because what happened next, the scalps, the massacres, the Lawrence raid, all of it, what happened next was not worth it. Holding those women was not worth 100 Josephine Andersons. It was not worth creating 100 Bill Andersons. This is the lesson that the border war teaches us. Violence creates violence. Cruelty creates cruelty. Every act of brutality plants seeds that will grow into more brutality. Bill Anderson did not emerge from nowhere. He was cultivated by Union policies that imprisoned civilians, by Jayhawker raids that beat elderly women, by a military command structure that saw Confederate sympathizers as less than human. When they locked Josephine Anderson in that building, they were not just imprisoning a 14-year-old girl. They were creating her brother's transformation. They were ensuring that quiet Bill Anderson, the farmer who wanted to be left alone, would become Bloody Bill Anderson, the man with 53 scalps on his saddle. Now let me tell you what happened to the others. The men who rode with Bill, the boys who watched him count, because their stories reveal how far the ripples of Bill Anderson's violence extended. Jesse James. You know his name. Everyone knows his name. The most famous outlaw in American history. The man who robbed banks and trains and became a legend. Jesse was 16 when he rode with Bill Anderson. He was 17 when Bill died. And for the next 15 years, until his own death in 1882, Jesse James carried what he had learned in those guerrilla days. Jesse never talked about the scalps. He never mentioned them in interviews. But when he described Bill Anderson, and he did describe him on rare occasions, Jesse's voice changed. It became quieter, more careful, as if he was speaking about something sacred. "Bill Anderson was the bravest man I ever knew," Jesse said in an interview from 1879, "and the saddest. He carried something with him that weighed more than any of us could understand. His sister, that building, what the Union did to his family. It never left him. It was with him every minute of every day." Jesse paused here. "I learned from Bill that you cannot run from what you are carrying. You can only choose what to do with it. Bill chose vengeance. He chose counting. He chose to make them remember. I made different choices, but the weight is the same. It is always the same." Jesse James was killed by Robert Ford on April 3, 1882. He was 34 years old, the same age Bill Anderson would have been if he had survived another 9 years. Frank James, Jesse's older brother, lived much longer. He died in 1915 at the age of 72. He had outlived almost everyone from the guerrilla days, and in his final years, he spoke more openly about what he had witnessed. Frank gave an interview in 1913 about Bill Anderson. He was an old man by then. His hands trembled, his voice was thin, but his memory was clear. "Bill Anderson changed the war. Before Bill, we were fighting for the Confederacy. After Bill, after the scalps started, we were fighting for something else, something darker. We told ourselves it was justice. We told ourselves they had started it with Kansas City, but that was not the whole truth." Frank paused to catch his breath. "The truth was that Bill showed us what was possible. He showed us that there were no rules, that the Union could not protect its soldiers from us, that we could do anything, and there was no punishment worse than what had already been done to us. That was what Bill taught, not how to scalp, how to stop being afraid." Frank James shook his head. "And we should have been afraid. That fear, that reluctance to do certain things, that was what made us human. When Bill lost it, he became something else. And we followed him. God help us. We followed him into places no man should go." Frank's final words about Bill Anderson were simple. "I think about him sometimes. Bill Anderson. I wonder what would have happened if his sister had lived, if that building had not fallen, if everything had been different. Would Bill have been a farmer? Would he have had children? Would he have grown old and peaceful and forgotten by history?" Frank looked at the interviewer with eyes that had seen too much. "We will never know, because the Union did not let him be a farmer. They made him into a weapon, and then they had to destroy the weapon they had created. Little Archie Clement. I mentioned him before, the 17-year-old who was completely devoted to Bill Anderson. His story ended differently. After Bill's death, little Archie kept fighting. He led his own guerrilla band. He continued the war even after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and he continued the practices he had learned from Bill Anderson. In December 1866, 26 months after Bill Anderson died, little Archie rode into Lexington, Missouri. He was drunk, he was armed, and he was looking for trouble. What happened next depends on who you believe. The official story is that little Archie started a fight in a saloon, that the sheriff tried to arrest him, that little Archie drew his gun and was shot down by militia members who happened to be nearby. The unofficial story, the one whispered among former guerrillas for years afterward, was that little Archie was executed, that the militia had been waiting for him, that someone had informed on him, that the whole thing was an ambush, just like the ambush that had killed Bill Anderson. Either way, little Archie Clement died in the street. He was 20 years old. They found 4 scalps on his body. He had learned well from Bill Anderson. He had kept counting. But little Archie was the last. After his death, the practice of scalping faded from Missouri. The border war was over. The organized guerrilla bands had disbanded. The men who remained, Jesse James, Frank James, Cole Younger, all the others, they became bandits instead of warriors. They robbed banks, they robbed trains, they shot anyone who got in their way, but they did not scalp. That practice died with Bill Anderson and little Archie Clement. The counting stopped. But the memory survived. I need to tell you one more thing about Bill Anderson, one more detail that brings everything together. One more piece of the story that explains why, 160 years later, we are still talking about him. The knife. Remember the knife? The kitchen knife that had belonged to Bill's grandmother? The knife that Josephine had wrapped with that note. "Bill, come home soon. I miss you. Love, Josie." That knife was taken from Bill Anderson's body after he died. It was claimed as a trophy by a Union officer named Samuel Cox. He kept it for 30 years. When he died in 1894, his family donated it to a museum in Missouri. The knife is still there. You can see it if you want. It sits in a glass case with other artifacts from the Civil War, a simple wooden-handled kitchen knife. Nothing special about it except for the history it carries. And wrapped around the handle, preserved under glass, is a piece of paper so fragile that it cannot be unfolded anymore. But scholars have photographed it. They have used special imaging techniques to read the faded handwriting. "Bill, come home soon. I miss you. Love, Josie." Every time Bill Anderson drew that knife, every time he added another number to his count, he saw those words. He felt that paper against his palm. He remembered his sister. That was what the counting was about. Not revenge, not justice, not even vengeance in the simple sense. It was about remembering. Josephine Anderson died at 14 years old, crushed under rubble while Union soldiers watched. Her brother could not save her. He was not there when she called his name. He arrived too late to do anything but hold her hand while she died. Bill Anderson could not save his sister, but he could make sure she was never forgotten. He could count, he could braid, he could carry her bloody dress in his saddlebag and her note wrapped around his knife and her memory in every action he took. 53 scalps, 53 payments in a debt of memory, 53 names that Bill Anderson knew because knowing them was how he kept Josephine alive. This is not a story that has a lesson. It is not a story that ends with a moral. It is a story about what humans are capable of when they break. When grief becomes rage, when love becomes violence, when a quiet farmer from Kansas becomes the most feared guerrilla in Missouri. Bill Anderson was 24 years old when he scalped his first man. 24, young enough to have an entire life ahead of him, old enough to know exactly what he was doing. And by 25, by the time those Union bullets finally stopped his count, he had done it 53 times. 1 year, 53 scalps, 53 braids in his saddle, 53 names he would never forget. She was 14. That was what he said. Every time someone asked, every time someone tried to understand, every time someone questioned whether what he was doing was justified, she was 14. 3 words, an explanation, a justification, a memorial. And those 3 words echo through history. They echo through every story told about Bloody Bill Anderson. They echo through every museum where his artifacts are displayed. They echo through every documentary and book and discussion of the border war. She was 14, Josephine Anderson, crushed under rubble, dying slowly while she called for her brother. Bill Anderson made sure we would never forget her. He paid for that memory in blood, and the count, the terrible, meticulous, heartbreaking count, was his monument to a sister he could not save. If you have ever lost someone you loved, if you have ever felt grief so deep that it changed who you were, then you understand something about Bill Anderson. Not his methods. His methods were monstrous. But his motivation, his need to make sense of senseless loss, his desperate attempt to give meaning to something that had no meaning. That is what the counting was about. Finding meaning, creating order out of chaos, imposing logic on a universe that had killed a 14-year-old girl for no reason at all. Bill Anderson failed, of course. The counting could never bring Josephine back. The scalps could never balance the account. The vengeance could never fill the hole that her death had left in his heart. But he kept counting anyway, because counting was all he had. 53. That was the final number. That was where the count stopped. That was all Bill Anderson had time to accomplish before his own death caught up with him. And somewhere, in whatever comes after death, I like to think that Josephine was waiting for him. Bill, come home soon. I miss you. Love, Josie. He finally came home, after 53 payments, after 18 months of counting, after a transformation so complete that the quiet farmer had been erased entirely. Bill Anderson came home, and the count was finally done. You have just heard one of the most disturbing stories of the American Civil War. A story of grief and vengeance and violence that spiraled beyond all control. A story of a 14-year-old girl and the brother who refused to let the world forget her. Stories like this, the stories they do not teach in schools, take time to research and tell properly. When you use Super Thanks, you help us uncover more forgotten history. Every contribution supports the work of bringing these stories to light. Was Bill Anderson a monster? He did monstrous things. 53 scalps, each one a human being, each one someone's son or husband or father or friend. But Bill Anderson was also a victim, created by a war that had no rules, transformed by a union policy that imprisoned children, broken by a building that collapsed on his 14-year-old sister while she called his name. The border war made men like Bill Anderson. The question is whether we have learned anything from it, whether we understand that cruelty breeds cruelty, that violence breeds violence, that every 14-year-old we sacrifice to military necessity creates the possibility of another bloody Bill. What do you think? Was Bill Anderson born a monster? Or did Missouri make him into one? Was the counting an act of madness or an act of love twisted beyond recognition? History does not give easy answers, but it remembers the questions, and it remembers the count. 53. She was 14.